Welcome back to the Book of Fables. Last time we looked at a popular and enduring character, the Big Bad Wolf, and we talked about how it transitioned from representing wildness and menace from nature to representing the darkness already inside of people, the bloodlust that lies beneath the surface of polite society, and the fight there is between order and chaos that goes on inside all of us, and especially in Big B Wolf. So today, instead of looking at a character that's in many fables, let's look at a particular fairy tale, or rather a collection of very similar ones. Let's take a look at Donkey Skin. I'd never heard the fable before this game, so I assumed it was a relatively minor one, and it is today. Mostly because of the whitewashing that was applied to a lot of fables and fairy tales by the church, by protective bodies, and certainly by Disney and people marketing to kids in this century. It'd be very hard to incorporate this fable after that, but in fact, centuries ago, it was a tremendously popular story. It's got all kinds of variations around the world. It's even got its own category, its own classification in the Arne Thompson classification system, which is a way of classifying fables by their plots. It's ATU 510B, Unnatural Love, which I guess makes sense. I said there's a lot of variations and names for this story, and just some of them are Catskin, Little Catskin, Cap O' Rushes, Allerleirauh, or Allerleirauh, like they said in the game, the king who wished to marry his daughter, very imaginatively titled, the she-bear, Mossy Coat, Tattercoats, the princess that wore a rabbit skin dress, the bear, Fair Maria Wood, Broom Throw, Brush Throw, Comb Throw, Betta Pilusa, Pillaroo, Sackcloth, the Maiden Without Hands. The list goes on, and these are from countries all around the world. The first records of it being written down are from the 1500s, but it was almost certainly told before that. So whatever this is a popular story that really captured the imagination of a lot of people. Now, there's various levels of darkness in these tales. Actually, Cinderella is one of the happier retellings of the tale. It has a lot of the worst elements taken out, which is probably one of the reasons we don't know Donkey Skin today. It's been more or less replaced in the popular imagination and storytelling by Cinderella. So the basic story goes like this. There's a mother and a father, almost always a king and queen. The queen dies, the father is looking for a new wife. In most of the tales, the queen makes him promise before her death to only marry somebody who's as good looking as she is, or who can wear her ring or fit into her shoes, sometimes somebody who has golden hair or a birthmark just like hers. Now, invariably, this is the daughter. In almost all of the tales, the daughter doesn't want to be married to her father because that's an incestuous relationship, and so she seeks help from someplace. Sometimes she goes to the grave of her mother to get advice, which is strange, but sometimes she goes to a confessor or a member of the church. Sometimes it's an old woman that lives next door or a neighbor, and she usually makes demands of her father. She demands certain kinds of dresses. Some can be very pretty, but will eventually be an ugly one, and so that will be the donkey skin dress, or the bear, or the mouse fur, or the all kinds of fur in the Allerleirauh. Anything like that. And using that last dress, she's able to escape, disguising herself and as a servant, and joins some other household, typically in a neighboring kingdom. Sometimes it can be far away. But while she's there, she is sort of the lowest of the lowest servant girl, and somehow catches the eye of the prince. Now, while she's there, she's almost always abused fairly badly. She's beaten, I think Cinderella in this case. She's treated very poorly by her stepsisters, which in this case are the stand-in for the servants at the other castle. A lot of the times, it's the actual prince himself who abuses her while she is dressed in her disguise. He will throw things at her. The story Broom Throw, Brush Throw, Comb Throw is based around that he threw brooms and brushes and combs at her. But when he is able to see her during balls, she'll work out a way to go to balls and look pretty again, put on her good dresses, and comb her hair and everything. He's really taken with her. He asks where she's from, and she teasingly responds something that has to do with his abuse. So in Broom Throw, Brush Throw, Comb Throw, he says, "Where are you from?" And she says, "I'm from the country of Broom Throw." And he doesn't catch on to this. He doesn't understand what's happening. Sometimes it's not the prince that abuses her, so I guess it would make more sense that he wouldn't understand why she's saying she's from broken broom in one story because the cook had broken a broom over her back or something like that. Anyway, eventually she's unmasked. Sometimes that's willingly. In some stories she's required to cook or bake something to heal him. And so she'll put a ring that shows who she is in the porridge that she makes for him or in the meal or something, and then he discovers that way. Sometimes he violently tears the dress off of her and reveals her beauty underneath, and they end up being married, and then they live happily ever after. So that's the basic structure of the tale. Now, there is obviously a lot going on in this tale, and it's actually fairly complex. It's interesting on a number of different levels. I was reading a lot of ways of analyzing the story, and they seem to break down into a psychological and a literal point of view. Obviously, at some point, it's just an entertaining story that people like to tell back and forth, but at some point, this is touching on things that are important to people. And what people think this story especially touches on is the experience, as unfortunate as it may be, of domestic abuse and unwanted incestuous advances, especially of a daughter by a father. That was very unfortunately common even today, and was certainly much more so back in the Middle Ages. There were supposed to be checks, societal checks, to keep this kind of thing from happening. Nevertheless, there is evidence that it was fairly common. So, to address that theme, some people, like I said, have looked at it from a psychological point of view, and those people have tended to look at it from either a Freudian or a Jungian interpretation. A Freudian, as you know, is all about repressed desires and the struggle with sexuality as one grows up. And so Freudian interpretations have tended to look at this fable as actually expressing the Electra complex. So the Oedipus complex is what they would say that young men go through, where they have desires early in their life to essentially replace their father, kill the father, and marry, have relations with the mother. And so the struggle against those taboo thoughts leads to a lot of neuroses if it's not properly dealt with. The Electra complex is essentially just the opposite, that girls desire to replace their mother and wed their father. At the same time, they are repulsed by these thoughts because, again, they're taboo and unacceptable. And so the death of the queen and the king being forced into accepting the daughter as a bride is a way of sort of psychologically processing and dealing with these particular thoughts. And the rest of the narrative is the young woman sort of working out a punishment for herself, willingly working in degrading conditions until finally rising up out of it and becoming the head of another household and finding a suitable mate in the prince at the end. Now, I'm not a big fan of this kind of interpretation, and a lot of people today aren't, essentially because this is a form of victim blaming. This is a way of saying the reason that this story happened the way it did is in some way because of the desires of the victims. And psychoanalysis has, especially Freudian psychoanalysis, has had some problems dealing with victim blaming and dealing with identifying with patriarchy and authority figures throughout the ages, and I think this is a good example of this. There aren't really clues to me in the story that any of this is desired by the young woman, desired by the princess. Although, in some of the very darkest retellings of the story, the king actually ends up marrying her, the daughter, and some of them will close with them saying the daughter had desired her father's love and doesn't question the way in which it comes, which is just so dark and creepy. And in the worst one, which is actually sort of a modern retelling, the wife, the queen died in childbirth, and then the daughter marries the king and also dies in childbirth, and it's kind of implied that, like, her child will, when she comes of age, suffer the same fate, which is just yeah, I'm not a big fan of the Freudian analysis from that point of view. Jungian analysis is going to focus more on archetypes, and so it looks at the idea of, it takes that idea of the feminine idea maturing, or the feminine ideal maturing and getting away from this oppressive, domineering male figure towards an also dominating but much more benevolent male figure later in life, so the growing up time. And that hasn't been quite as common, but I am certainly more in favor of that way of looking at it. Now, from a literal perspective, these would be talking people creating fantasies to help process actual situations that happened. And again, as I discussed earlier, the concept of sexual abuse and unwanted advances would have been fairly common in a medieval time. And I read a really interesting paper by this psychologist who says the way the story itself is molded, and the way that the girl acts, and the way that all the characters act, do seem to mirror, in some ways, what he sees in survivors and people who have gone through these kind of unwanted advances and abuse early in their life. There tends to be a tendency to blame the mother for not stepping in and being a protective figure, as opposed to blaming the father, who is the actual aggressor. And in this case, what's interesting in a lot of these stories is they kind of go out of their way to make the king not really at fault for what he does. He's trying to marry his daughter and forces her to leave, but yeah, he only did it because he promised his wife that he would marry somebody beautiful, or it has to be the person whose ring this fits. It's like someone else is really at fault, and really that person ends up being the queen in a lot of these stories. She made him promise and then died and left this girl without a helper. And so that's one way that the girl relates to women, especially her mother. And the theory is, at least, that the other way she relates to women is in this helping and freeing way, which is how she relates to the person that she gets help from. In some stories, she actually gets assistance from her mother, or in other stories, it's somebody else that she trusts, some other woman who's sort of taking on a maternal figure. And so she finds a way to deal with her father and to find her means of escape. And her means of escape is to disguise herself, and it's always ugly. She never disguises herself to look more beautiful or even just different. She takes on this ugly disguise and goes and works as the lowest of the low servant girl in a neighboring kingdom. And that is often seen as, if we were going off the psychological profile of survivors, there is often this self-blaming and tremendous amount of guilt and self-punishment that a lot of them go through. And so you could see it as that way, to help people who are having those feelings have a character to identify with and be able to process things. And then again, the end result in this can be, and kind of a hopeful note in some of the stories, that she was under this oppressive rule of her father and things were not good, and she found a way to escape, to enter a household that she desired, teases the prince with her identity, doesn't really reveal it in some of the stories until she's ready to, and some of them her hand is forced, but then at the end is able to become queen in her own right and find a suitable mate who is not her father, who's another young man. That's sort of the brightest interpretation of it. Now, obviously, it gets, darker in different tellings. The guy is abusive. And something which is kind of interesting is, in a lot of the stories, the prince that she marries is basically indistinguishable from the father figure in the beginning. Domineering, harsh, somebody who doesn't take a lot of her opinions, somebody who doesn't take her advice and doesn't really care what she wants. In some of the stories, he forces her to tell her story, and he pulls the dress off of her and makes her his queen, and there's not a whole lot of debate as to what she would care to do. However, for situations like that, I do think we should keep in mind that this was a fairy tale which started being told prior to the 1500s, and so there wasn't a whole lot of emphasis placed on what women actually wanted during the time. But nevertheless, the story of growing up and of escape from a bad situation and of self-punishment leading eventually to escape from that life, to throwing off the cloak, even if it's pulled off in the brighter stories, to throwing off the cloak that hid her and disguised her and taking on her identity again, is something I think which just really powerfully resonates with people. And this is a story which is no longer told today, and in a way that's good, because it is a creepy story, and it sometimes has a creepy ending, and it needs, obviously, a lot of work before it turns into anything like a good story that you would want to tell your kids. But at the same time, for a society in which women were marginalized and oppressed as much as Western Europe at that time, or Eastern Europe, or heck, anywhere that it was told, it has a remarkably resourceful and independent and effective heroine in it. And so I think there's a lot of depth and complexity to this story. In some ways, the princess is very passive, just kind of letting things happen to her, accepting her punishments and things like that. but in some ways she's very active, working behind the scenes to make things happen, leaving of her own accord her father's house, working without complaint as a servant for a long time. So there is just a lot of depth and interesting parts to this story. If you think of something that you would like to add, by all means, I would love to hear about it in the thread. But that's just the little tip of the iceberg that I got from my initial forays. There's a tremendous amount of work being done on the interpretation and analysis of this story. I think just because it's so bizarre and has so many depths. So just like the character Faith in the game, we might look down on her for her choice of professions, where she was up against a hard time and immediately turned to prostitution. But at the same time, she did come from a pretty hard times past, and she's got some depths, or had some depths, that we probably would have liked to have gotten to know, and she was an interesting character. Oh, and one more just little thing. I said that the prince is often indistinguishable from her father, and presuming that genetics work out, and that people tend to look like their parents in this game. Take a look at Prince Lawrence when we meet him. We already saw him once in the mirror. To my mind, he looks an awful lot like Faith does. So I wonder if that's another little sly reference. Anyway, that's all I've got about the story of Donkey Skin. Hope that helps you understand things a little bit better, and I will see you guys next time.